Have you ever felt a chill running down your spine while walking through London's misty streets? Beneath its bustling exterior, London hides secrets. Ancient, vengeful spirits that have haunted the city for centuries. From the eerie whispers of the Bloody Tower to the spirits beneath the Thames, these are not just ghost stories. They're the echoes of those who never truly left. What happens when the dead reach across time to reclaim what they lost? The Haunting of London uncovers dark secrets buried deep in the city's past, and you're invited to witness the terror. Dare to uncover them? London, a city of towering skyscrapers, grand history, and modern triumphs. Yet beneath its polished streets and stunning architecture, something far darker lurks. The Haunting of London takes you beyond the landmarks, into the forgotten corners of the city, where history's ghosts stir restlessly, seeking vengeance, peace, or release. From the oppressive corridors of the Tower of London, where lost souls wander endlessly, to the murky depths beneath the Thames, where ancient spirits wait to rise again, these stories offer more than just a scare. They reveal the lost, buried tales of the city's past. Have you ever noticed the cold air that seems to press in when you stand in certain spots? Or heard a whisper on the wind, where no one is speaking? This isn't your typical ghost story. This is about ancient forces that were sealed away long ago, and now they're rising again. The stories of the Seance Club of Soho, the Watcher in Westminster, and the Puppet Master of Piccadilly are just a few of the terrifying tales woven through the very fabric of London itself. Each place, each story, is linked by a dark thread that connects the living and the dead. As you journey deeper into these chilling legends, you'll find that some spirits are not content to remain in the past. They demand attention and revenge. As you listen, you'll start to question, what if the past is never truly gone? What if the dead are always watching? Are you ready to hear these stories? To discover the truth about London's hidden horrors? Come closer. The ghosts are waiting to tell their stories. But once you know the truth, can you ever truly walk these streets the same way again? Story number 1. The London Underground had always been a place of mystery, a labyrinth of forgotten tunnels, half-buried secrets, and stories whispered from one generation to the next. Claire Everhart, a history graduate student with a thirst for the unknown, was drawn to those stories. As part of her final project, she set out to document the hidden corners of London's underground system, places most people never thought to visit, let alone step foot in. Her friends, Milo, Tasha, and Jace, joined her on this latest venture, a journey deeper into the forgotten parts of the city than any of them had ever dared go before. It was a crisp evening in late autumn when they arrived at the entrance to the abandoned station. The air was thick with fog, and the wind whispered secrets only the brave or foolish would listen to. The station wasn't on any map, and no one had entered it in decades. It was a place where the very walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for someone to disturb their silence. They had all heard the rumors, of course. Strange disappearances, whispers in the dark, people claiming to have seen shadowy figures on old rusted trains, but that was just the stuff of urban legend, wasn't it? Claire was the first to step down into the darkened platform, the soft scuff of her boots the only sound in the quiet. The others followed reluctantly, each of them feeling the chill crawl up their spines as they crossed the threshold into the forgotten station. "How far down does this go?" Jace asked, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Farther than anyone's dared to go in years," Claire replied, her eyes sparkling with the excitement of the unknown. The platform was thick with dust, and the air felt old, heavy with the weight of forgotten years. Faded posters clung to the walls, their edges curled and yellowed. There were no lights, no signs of life. But as they ventured further into the bowels of the station, something began to feel wrong. Milo, the cameraman, was capturing every moment, his camera light cutting through the dark. He laughed nervously, trying to keep the mood light. This is going to make one hell of a documentary, right? But Claire was too focused, her eyes scanning the surroundings for anything that might tell her more about this lost place. The train. Tracks stretched endlessly in front of them, leading to tunnels that seemed to disappear into nothingness. That's when they first heard it, the whisper. At first, it was soft, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but then it grew louder, clearer and more distinct, though the words were unintelligible. It sounded like a language none of them recognized. Tasha's eyes went wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" They all nodded, their unease growing. The whisper seemed to come from every direction, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the very ground, beneath their feet. Claire's heart pounded, but her curiosity kept her moving forward. "Let's keep going. We have to find out what this place really is." As they ventured deeper into the station, they stumbled across something that made their blood run cold. A ghostly train, its once shiny surface now covered in grime and rust, waiting on the tracks. The doors opened with an eerie hiss, but there was no driver, no passengers, nothing except the faint scent of mildew and decay. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway. A man, dressed in a conductor's uniform, stood there, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to freeze them in place. Tasha let out a soft cry. "The conductor," she whispered, her voice trembling. The others stared, but the man didn't move. It was as if he wasn't even aware of them, and yet they could feel him watching them, waiting. Milo's camera shook in his hands. "This is insane," he muttered. "It's like he's stuck here." Then the whispers grew louder. They were no longer words, they were pleas. "Help me. Get out. Leave." But they weren't coming from the walls anymore. They were coming from the train, from the passengers. Ghostly figures trapped in eternal motion, their faces frozen in terror. Claire's heart raced. "What is this place?" she whispered. "What's happening here?" The answer came in a voice, so faint at first it almost seemed like her own thoughts. "It's not just a station, it's a prison." The air grew thick, and Claire felt her legs weaken. A dark shadow flickered behind her, and when she turned, she saw the conductor. His eyes hollow, his face twisted into something neither human nor ghost. He was no longer just a figure, he was a force that would not let them leave. "You're here because you were meant to be." His voice echoed in the air, hollow and ancient. "What do you mean?" Claire shouted, her voice cracking. The conductor stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Time loops here. The station demands what it is owed. A soul in exchange for escape." And then Claire understood. The whispers, the passengers. They were all the souls of those who had entered the station and never left. They were trapped, forever repeating their final commutes, caught in an endless loop of time, just like the station itself. It was too late to turn back. In that moment, Claire realized with horror that one of them was already dead. Milo had been pale the entire time, his skin too cold, his movements too stiff. He hadn't been alive when they entered. The station. They hadn't noticed because the station had already claimed him. he was one of the trapped souls now. Tasha screamed, her eyes wide with terror, but before she could say anything more, a figure reached out from the darkness, a cold hand gripping her throat, pulling her into the shadows. Jace stumbled backwards, shouting for her, but the shadows swallowed her whole, leaving only the faintest trace of her presence behind. Claire was paralyzed with fear. She had to escape. She had to survive. But the station had other plans. The conductor was moving closer, his gaze colder than ever. There was no way out. The train, the passengers, the station, they were all part of the same terrible cycle. Only Claire made it to the surface. She stumbled out of the tunnels, gasping for air, her mind reeling with what she had witnessed. She couldn't speak. She couldn't explain. The words were lost in her throat. Her mind was shattered, broken by the horrors she had seen. All she could hear now were the whispers. The same whispers that had followed her into the world above. And as she wandered through the streets of London, the whispers never stopped. They were always with her. The station would never let her go. Story number 2. Every night, without fail, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the bells of Blackfriars would ring. Not in any church, not in any tower. No, the bells came from the ruined remains of what was once a thriving abbey, long abandoned and broken by time. The sound echoed through the empty streets, sharp and clear, reverberating through the heart of London. And yet there was no bell to be seen. No bell tower, no sign of anything that could make such a sound. Dr. Helena Moore had heard the stories, of course. They were the kind of whispers that bounced around the local pubs, carried on the wind to anyone with an ear for the strange. But Helena was no stranger to the unexplained. She was a historian, yes, but more than that, she was an expert in the occult and haunted architecture. The kind of things that most people turned their eyes away from. And those bells, they intrigued her. It wasn't long before she found herself on the trail of the haunting sound. Every night she listened to the bells ring, her curiosity growing until it became an obsession. She began to study the ruins of Blackfriars, long abandoned by the church, left to crumble in silence. It was a perfect place for the dead to leave. Their mark, a place forgotten by the living but never by the spirits. Helena wasn't alone in her investigation. She brought along her tech assistant, Tom, a young man with a mind for gadgets and an open mind for the paranormal. He set up cameras, EVP recorders, and a dozen other tools in the hope of capturing something that would explain the strange phenomena. They also sought the help of Reverend Bain, a modern priest who seemed willing to face what others feared. And then there was old Nan, the local woman who had lived near Blackfriars all her life. Her knowledge of the place went beyond history. She spoke of things few dared mention. Things like curses, old rituals, and the dark history of the monks who once called Blackfriars home. It was old Nan who first told Helena of the terrible tale that had been buried in the abbey's ashes. "A curse," old Nan had said, her voice a rasp like dried leaves. "It's been there for centuries, you know. When Blackfriars was still standing, those monks were a special kind. They practiced dark rituals, stuff the church wouldn't even speak about. But one of them, he betrayed. The others sold them out, and on the night of the fire, the bells rang, louder than anything you've ever heard." Helena had been skeptical, but as she dug deeper, the truth started to come to light. The monks had been burned alive, accused of heresy and treason. The fire had claimed them all, but the bells, the sound that echoed every night at 3:33, told another story. A story of revenge. of a betrayal so deep that the spirits of the monks couldn't rest. One among them had turned on the others, and he had doomed them all. It was a betrayal that Helena couldn't shake. Something about it gnawed at her, as though the story wasn't just something she was learning. It was something she was remembering. One night, as the bells rang at exactly 3:33 a.m., Helena's mind seemed to fracture. The sound filled the air, but this time it wasn't just an echo. She felt the vibrations in her bones, deep, like a call she could not ignore. The world around her seemed to melt. The air grew thick, suffocating. The stones beneath her feet felt hot, as though they had been recently scorched. And in that moment, the truth slammed into her. Helena gasped. She saw it. A vision, no, a memory of men in robes, their faces twisted in agony. She was standing in the midst of them, but she wasn't herself. She was someone else. A monk, a traitor. She knew, deep in her core, that she had been the one to betray them. She had been the one who sold the others out. And now, the flames were rising around them, the fire devouring everything. The bells rang louder, so loud it drowned out the screams of the monks burning alive. The betrayal, the fire, it was all too much. Helena wanted to scream, but her voice was gone. She was trapped in the past, trapped in the fire. When she snapped back to the present, she was gasping for air, shaking. Tom was standing over her, his face pale with concern. "Helena, what's going on? What happened?" She couldn't answer. The vision had been too real, too vivid. She was dizzy, as though she had stepped out of time. But it was clear now. She wasn't just investigating. The curse. She was part of it. She was the reincarnation of the traitor monk who had caused the fire. And now, that monk's ghost was awake, seeking her out. Brother Caldus. The vengeful ghost had already begun to haunt Helena's every step. He was the one who had cursed Blackfriars, and now he would not rest until the traitor had paid. And Helena, trapped in the role she had once played, was the one he sought. His vengeful spirit followed her wherever she went, his cold, empty eyes always on her. It didn't take long for the breaks between Helena's present and the past to become more frequent. Time began to lose its meaning. Sometimes she was in the ruins of Blackfriars with Tom, trying to record something, and the next moment she was back in the flames. The monks were burning. The bells were ringing. And she was standing there in the middle of it all, paralyzed by guilt and fear. She was the one who had betrayed them. She was the one who had caused their deaths. "Helena, you have to break the curse," Reverend Bain said one day, his face lined with worry. "You have to face your past. You have to relive that night and undo what was done." But there was no way out. No matter what she did, she couldn't escape. Each time she thought she had broken free, the bells rang again, pulling her back. The fire, the betrayal, the screams. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that moment, watching the flames consume the monks, knowing that she was the one who had betrayed them. She was the reason for their suffering, and so the cycle continued. Every night the bells rang, and Helena was pulled back to the same moment, the same fiery night. She would relive it again and again, over and over, each time in more vivid detail, each time with more pain, more guilt. She was trapped in the curse she could never escape. The bells of Blackfriars tolled forever, and so did Helena's torment. Story number 3. The fog rolled in without warning, thick and heavy, swallowing East London whole. It wasn't like the normal mist you'd see in the morning. No, this fog was different. It was unnatural, cold, and all-consuming. By the time Layla, Carter woke up, the entire city was blanketed, the streets invisible, the air thick and suffocating. The once bustling neighborhood outside her window had gone silent, eerily still. Layla rubbed her eyes, the remnants of a restless sleep clinging to her like the fog outside. Her younger sister, Megan, wasn't in her room. That wasn't unusual. Megan often sneaked out late, avoiding their tense home. But tonight felt different. "Megan," Layla called, voice trembling, though she tried to push the fear down. She stood at the window, staring into the gray abyss. There was no sign of movement, no sign of life. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Layla's heart began to race. She tried to shake it off. She hadn't heard Megan leave, but maybe she had snuck out while Layla had been asleep. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks. But then she noticed something worse. The door to the apartment was wide open. "Megan!" Layla shouted, rushing into her sister's room. The bed was empty, and the window was slightly cracked open. She rushed to it and looked out. Nothing. Just the fog, swirling in waves like a living thing. The clock on the wall showed 6:15 a.m., but the world outside looked as though it hadn't moved in hours. No cars, no voices, just the dense, choking fog. Layla grabbed her coat and phone, already dialing Megan's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. She stepped into the hallway, knocking on Mrs. Fields' door. Mrs. Fields was the elderly woman who lived next door. She was kind, but she knew more about the strange things in the neighborhood than anyone else. The fog, she knew about it. She had to. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Fields stood there, her frail body wrapped in a faded bathrobe. Her eyes were wide, panic-stricken. "Layla, you shouldn't be out in this fog," she warned, stepping aside so Layla could enter. "Mrs. Fields, where's Megan?" Layla's voice cracked. Mrs. Fields hesitated before speaking, her eyes darting nervously to the fog outside. "Your sister. She went into it. I saw her last night before the fog came. She said she needed to get away. She felt like she couldn't breathe here anymore. Not with the way things were at home." Layla's chest tightened. Megan had been running from their abusive home for years. But this was something else. The fog was no ordinary weather. Mrs. Fields continued in a hushed voice. "The fog is no accident. It's a gateway, a passage to another world. A world that takes what it wants. Once you're in, you're never quite the same. If you go after her, be careful. The fog doesn't just trap you, it changes you." "Changes me? What do you mean?" Layla's voice was shaking now. "You'll understand when you see it. But if you enter, you'll have to decide whether to leave or to stay. It's not a choice anyone gets to make lightly." Mrs. Fields stepped back, her hands trembling as she reached out and handed Layla a small silver locket. "This belonged to your mother. She had it when she first crossed paths with the fog." Layla nodded, swallowing her fear. She couldn't stay here. Megan was out there somewhere, and she wasn't going to let her sister face whatever the fog held alone. The moment she stepped outside, the fog hit her like a wall. Cold and wet, it clung to her skin, making every breath feel heavier than the last. Layla forced her way through it, eyes straining to see even a few feet in front of her. She could hear nothing, no footsteps, no voices. It was like the world had been swallowed by silence. "Where are you, Meg?" she muttered to herself, her voice barely a whisper in the thick air. Suddenly, a figure appeared through the mist. A tall man with a gaunt face and eyes as hollow as the fog itself. His clothes were tattered, as though they had been weathered by years in the mist. He was a guide, and he knew the fog well. His name was the Hollow Man, though no one knew much about him, other than the fact that he led people through this twisted, forgotten version of London. "Looking for someone?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly. "Megan," Layla replied, her voice barely more than a breath. The Hollow Man gave a short, hollow laugh. Megan entered the fog willingly. She thought she could escape it all. But this place? It's a place for the lost, the forgotten. Layla's mind raced. "What do you mean? What happened to her?" The Hollow Man tilted his head, his eyes empty but knowing. "Once you enter, you become part of this world, but you also lose yourself, your memories, your past, everything. Those who vanish, they're part of the fog now. They live here, but they're not alive anymore." Layla's chest tightened. Was Megan gone forever? She pressed forward, determined. She had to find her sister, no matter the cost. The Hollow Man turned to leave, but before he disappeared into the fog, he added, "You can find her, but once you do, you'll have to decide whether to leave with her or stay with the rest of us. The fog doesn't let anyone go without a price." Layla followed his fading footsteps, moving deeper into the mist. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat against the eerie stillness around her. She needed to find Megan. She had to. And then, through the haze, she saw her. Megan stood there, her back turned, staring out into the distance. She was the same, yet different. Her once fiery hair was now as pale as the fog, her eyes distant, lost. "Megan!" Layla called out, running toward her. But as she approached, her sister turned slowly, a hollow smile on her face. "Megan, what happened to you?" Layla asked, her voice cracking. Megan's smile faded, and her voice echoed with something distant, something not entirely human. "I had to escape, Layla. This was the only way. You can't understand, not yet." Layla reached out, her hand trembling. "Please, Megan. We can leave. We can go home." But Megan stepped back, shaking her head. "It's too late for that. I'm part of this place now. And you will be too. You can't escape the fog." Layla's heart sank. This wasn't her sister. Not anymore. But she couldn't leave her behind. She couldn't leave her alone in this world. So, she stepped forward, her body moving as if it had already made the decision for her. "I'll stay," she whispered, her voice a tremor of acceptance. "I'll stay with you, Meg. I'll stay." And as Layla disappeared into the mist, the fog closed behind her, swallowing her whole. And there she remained, lost in the fog, a part of a forgotten London that would never let her go. Story number 4. The first victim was found on a foggy Tuesday morning, just outside Whitechapel's Old District. The body was mutilated, arranged in the same sickening manner as the murders from over a century ago. Forensics called it an imitation of Jack the Ripper's famous killings, but to Dr. Elise Maris it felt different. She was a forensic psychologist, and this wasn't just a copycat. The patterns were too precise. The weather, the blood spatter, it all matched. Too perfectly. The killings continued, one after another, the same method, the same chilling precision. Each victim found with surgical care, as if Jack himself had returned. But how? Jack the Ripper had died over 100 years ago, hadn't he? Elise sat in her office looking at the photos of the crime scenes. The evidence was clear. The killer wasn't just mimicking Jack, they were channeling him. She had an unsettling thought, one that crawled under her skin like 1,000 tiny ants. Jack wasn't dead. He had never left. Dr. Elise Maris had spent her entire career studying the criminal mind, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she was starting to suspect. A parasitic demon, a body-hopping creature that fed off chaos, notoriety, and fear. And Jack the Ripper wasn't a man at all. He was something darker, something that had lived on in the history of Whitechapel, feeding on the darkness, hopping from host to host, leaving a trail of blood that spanned centuries. The detective in charge of the case, D.I. Walsh, didn't share Elise's theory. He was practical, grounded. "It's just a sicko trying to get attention. We'll catch him," he'd said. But Elise wasn't so sure. The deeper she dug, the more convinced she became. The murders were too precise. The weather, the blood patterns, it was as if the spirit of Jack had returned, choosing new victims, new hosts, each generation. The thought terrified her, but it made sense. Jack wasn't just a man. He was a parasitic spirit, a demon that thrived on fear, on violence. It was as if the fear of him had kept him alive all these years. And now he had returned, feeding on the same terror he had ignited. In the hearts of London's people a century ago, Elise knew she had to stop him. She couldn't let this thing, the thing she now called Jack, continue to consume the city. But as she investigated further, she started to feel the presence of something watching her. Something that had been waiting for her. She confided in her estranged brother Henry, who had always been skeptical of her work. But even he started to see the strange patterns. The people who survived the killings, all of them spoke of a shadow, a cold presence that seemed to take over their bodies, controlling them for a time before the murders started. One woman, Isla, who had barely escaped Jack's possession years ago, spoke to Elise about the terrifying things she remembered. "He doesn't just kill people," Isla said, her voice shaking. "He becomes them. He feeds off their pain. But it's not just the victims. It's everyone he touches. He makes them see things. He makes them think they're him." Elise's heart raced. She understood now. Jack didn't just kill, he possessed. He crawled into the minds of the living, taking over their bodies, twisting their thoughts, until they were nothing more than empty vessels for his evil to grow. As Elise dug deeper into Jack's history, she realized something that made her blood run cold. She wasn't just investigating Jack. She was becoming his next target, the next host. She had uncovered something that had drawn Jack to her. And now she could feel it slowly creeping into her mind. The dark whispers, the fleeting images of blood, the coldness in her bones. Henry tried to convince her to stop, to leave the case alone. "Elise, you're going too deep. This isn't just a serial killer, it's something else. You can't keep going down this path." But it was too late. The more she fought it, the stronger Jack's presence became. She could feel his touch on her mind, like icy fingers on her thoughts. He wanted her. He wanted to possess her, and she knew, deep down, that she was the one he was after. She was the next host. One night, as she sat in her office, the fog rolled in thick and heavy, just as it had on the nights of the murders. Elise's eyes widened as she looked out the window. The streets were quiet, too quiet. And then she saw him, A shadow moving through the fog, his figure indistinct but unmistakable. Jack, the parasite, the demon. He was coming for her. Elise knew what she had to do. She couldn't let herself become Jack's next victim. She had to stop him before he fully consumed her, before he turned her into another instrument of his evil. But how? It was Isla's words that haunted her. He's not a ghost. He's not just a man. He's a spirit of chaos, a demon that lives in the darkness. The only way to stop him is to lock yourself away, to let him take you, but not completely. Elise didn't hesitate. She contacted D.I. Walsh, telling him everything she'd learned. But it was too late to stop Jack. He was already inside her, clawing at her mind. She didn't trust herself anymore. She had to lock herself away before it was too late. She checked herself into a psychiatric hospital, requesting to be locked in a secure room with no windows. She told them she feared for her own safety. They didn't question her, and she was soon placed in a room, alone, the door locked behind her. The next few days were a blur of whispers, cold sweats, and nightmares. Jack's voice filled her head, urging her to give in, to let him take control. It was the only way to stop the killings, he said, to become one with him, to embrace the chaos. But Elise fought it. She locked herself away, forcing Jack to leave her body in peace. And when he could no longer reach her, when he realized he couldn't possess her, he turned his attention elsewhere. The killings stopped. The spirit of Jack, starved and rejected, moved on to another host, another body. Elise had stopped him, not with brute force, but with sheer willpower. She had locked herself away to keep him from consuming her, from becoming the thing that would continue the cycle of death. But even now, in the stillness of her isolation, Elise could still feel him. Jack wasn't gone. He was still out there, waiting for the next host, waiting for the next victim. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, when she feels the chill in the air or hears the faintest whisper, Elise wonders if Jack is still inside her, lurking, waiting for the right moment to return. Story number 5. Marcus Hayes had never believed in ghosts. Not really. He'd seen enough death in his years as a soldier to know that the dead didn't come back. But standing in front of the Tower of London at 2:10 a.m., his flashlight flickering, as the wind howled down the narrow alleyways, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night was colder than usual, and the shadows seemed deeper. The only sound was the quiet crunch of gravel beneath his boots and the occasional distant rattle of iron gates. As the night guard for the tower, Marcus had grown used to the isolation, the eerie quiet of the place. But tonight was different. The tower felt alive. It had been an uneventful shift until the whispers started. At first, Marcus thought it was the wind, but then he heard it again. Soft, breathy voices, carrying on the breeze, coming from the direction of the bloody tower. The sound was almost too faint to make out, but it was there, threading through the wind like a secret. A whisper of voices, lost in time. "Who's there?" he called, the hairs on his neck standing up. There was no reply. He walked toward the bloody tower, his flashlight cutting through the dark, casting long, twisting shadows on the ancient stone walls. The tower, centuries old, stood as a silent witness to the blood and betrayal that had stained its walls. As Marcus stepped inside, the temperature dropped and the air grew thick. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. He could almost hear words, though they were jumbled, distorted. He turned the corner and froze. Before him, in the center of the room, stood a woman, her face pale, her eyes hollow and dark. Her neck was tilted unnaturally, and her body was draped in a flowing gown that shimmered as if it were made of mist. It was Anne Boleyn. Her head was missing. "Help me," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "Help me, please. They've taken my soul." Marcus stepped back, heart pounding in his chest. This couldn't be real. He was a grown man, not some child with an overactive imagination. But there she was, standing before him, her ghostly form swaying as though caught in an unseen breeze. Anne's empty gaze locked onto him. "It was not I who was beheaded. They took my soul and left a hollow shell. The evil that resides here. It still feeds on suffering. It hides in the very walls." Marcus's throat went dry. "What are you talking about? Who did this to you?" "The tower," she said, her voice trembling with pain. "It has lived for centuries, feeding on the blood of the innocent, on the lives it takes. It has a hunger, and I was just the first. But I am not the only one." Anne's figure flickered, her form becoming more translucent. "There are others here, trapped. The ghosts of those who died here. The tower has consumed them. It feeds on their torment, on their history. It won't let go. It never lets go." Marcus didn't understand. He looked around, the cold air pressing in on him. The walls felt wrong, as if they were watching him, listening. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice shaking despite himself. "You are the one," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "The blood runs in your veins. You're of the line they never spoke of, the line meant to destroy it." "Destroy the tower?" Marcus's head spun. "What are you saying? I don't even know what you're talking about." But before she could answer, a new presence made itself known. A figure appeared in the corner of the room, a man in a tattered, dark cloak. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and his twisted smile was enough to freeze Marcus in place. "Richard III. Do you think you can defeat it, boy?" Richard sneered. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." The ghost of the king walked slowly toward him, his voice cold as the tombs beneath the tower. "The tower is ancient. It's alive, and it's fed on us all. The blood of the royals, the traitors, the enemies, all who came here to die." Marcus's heart raced. This wasn't some simple haunting. The tower itself, this ancient, monstrous building, was alive. It fed on history, on the suffering of those who had been trapped within its walls. The spirits of the dead, cursed to reenact their deaths, were all its victims. "The souls of the dead," Richard continued, "are bound to the tower. They can never escape, and neither can you." Marcus stumbled back. "But why me? Why now?" "Because you are the last," Anne's ghost whispered. "The blood runs in you. You are the one who was meant to end it." The tower seemed to shudder, a groan emanating from its ancient stones. The temperature dropped even further, the walls closing in. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Suddenly, Marcus understood. The tower wasn't just a building. It was a sentient force, a parasitic creature that had lived for centuries, feeding on the misery and betrayal it had caused. And now it wanted him. It wanted his soul to complete its feast. He could feel it, the pull, the pressure building, trying to take control of his mind, to make him one of its victims. He thought of his family, his life, and the weight of history. pressing down on him. And then, in a burst of clarity, he knew what he had to do. He turned and ran out of the bloody tower, ignoring the screams that followed him. He found the nearest entrance, rushing through the ancient halls of the tower until he was standing outside in the cold, crisp air. The tower loomed behind him, its dark silhouette against the night sky. And in that moment, Marcus made his choice. He would end it. With shaking hands, he pulled the lighter from his pocket and set the first match. The flame danced, flickered, and he tossed it onto the dry wood and stone of the tower's outer walls. The fire spread quickly, licking at the stones. Climbing higher and higher, the tower screamed, a low, guttural sound that shook the ground beneath his feet. The spirits of the dead wailed in agony, but it was too late. The tower was burning. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, something horrific happened. The ashes of the tower began to stir. The fire had not consumed it. It had only fed it. The tower reformed, rising from the ashes like some ancient monstrous thing. And Marcus knew, deep in his soul, that he had failed. The tower could never die. It was eternal. It fed on suffering, on pain, on history, and it would keep coming back again and again. Marcus turned away from the burning ruins of the tower, knowing the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Story number 6. Tommy Rook lived in the back alleys of Victorian-era London, where the cobblestones were slick with the grime of the city, and the air was thick with smoke from the factories that never stopped working. He was a scrappy boy, small for his age but quick on his feet, and more than anything, he longed for a place to belong. He had no family to speak of, no parents, no siblings, just the empty streets and the other street urchins who scraped by, the same way he did. The workhouse was no place for a boy like him, but it was where he ended up when the streets became too dangerous. Mr. Grimes, the cruel workhouse master, was the closest thing Tommy had to a father. And it was a father figure that Tommy desperately craved, though he never got one from Grimes. Instead, all he got was grueling work, hunger, and harsh words. But it wasn't the workhouse that Tommy thought about when he went to bed at night. It was the sound. The strange, soft lullabies that echoed through the alleyways when the moon was high. It wasn't a woman singing them, though that's what it sounded like at first. No, it was something far stranger. The first time Tommy heard the lullaby, it seemed to come from nowhere. He'd been walking home from the workhouse, his stomach growling from hunger, when the soft melody drifted to his ears. It was a slow, sweet tune, and something about it tugged at his heart, making him stop in his tracks. He looked down the narrow alleyway, but there was no one there. Not a soul. But then he saw it. A figure pushing a cart. The cart was strange, made of dark wood, with rusty wheels that creaked as they turned. But the most unsettling thing about it was the pile of bones stacked high in the cart, clicking against each other with every turn. Tommy's eyes widened, and his breath caught in his throat. The figure pushing the cart was tall, cloaked in rags, and seemed to glide through the air rather than walk. The face was obscured by a dark hood, but Tommy could feel its eyes on him, cold and knowing. The lullaby drifted closer, the words haunting in their simplicity. "Hush, little one. Don't you cry. The rag and bone man's passing by." Tommy shuddered and backed away, but the song lingered in his mind as sweet and sorrowful as a dream. Over the next few weeks he heard it again, always at night, always just as he was drifting into sleep. It was as if the rag and bone man was calling him. But Tommy was not the only one who heard it. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a strange coincidence. Disappearances, children vanishing without a trace. The other orphans at the workhouse whispered about it, but no one dared speak aloud. They all feared the rag and bone man, though none could explain why. Tommy's thoughts began to spiral. He realized that the lullaby was always followed by a disappearance. The children who had vanished, he now understood, had been led away by the figure, one by one, as though they had been called by some invisible force. He knew he had to stop it, but how? How could a small, scrappy boy like him stand against something so powerful, so ancient? It wasn't until Lizzie, his friend and fellow orphan, disappeared that Tommy finally understood. Lizzie had been the closest thing to a sister that Tommy had ever known. They'd shared meals, laughter, and even the same meager dreams of one day escaping the harshness of their lives. When she disappeared, the grief almost crushed him. But it was then, in the empty silence of the alleyway where Lizzie had last been seen, that Tommy realized the truth. The rag and bone man wasn't a demon, a monster, or a shadow. He was something else entirely. A spirit, a collector of forgotten souls. He gathered the children no one remembered, the orphans with no one to mourn them. They were the lost ones, the discarded ones, and he took them in the night, offering them peace in exchange for their suffering. Tommy felt a cold shiver run through him as he understood what had happened to him too. He was already dead. His body was gone, lost to some unseen fate, and he lingered now, caught between life and death because of the guilt that weighed heavy on his soul. He had never been able to escape the workhouse, never been able to leave the pain behind, and because of that, he was stuck, an empty shell roaming the streets. He was already one of the forgotten, and the rag and bone man was offering him peace, offering him release from the pain. It was then that the figure appeared again, as though summoned by Tommy's realization. The rag and bone man, pushing his cart of bones, came to a stop before him. The hooded figure bent down, and Tommy could feel the coldness of death in the air around him. But there was no malice in the spirit's presence. There was only the sadness of years and years of forgotten souls. The rag and bone man spoke softly, his voice like the rustle of leaves. "You've carried the weight of your grief long enough, child. The lullaby you hear, it is not to bring fear, but peace. Come with me, Tommy. Your suffering can end." Tommy stared at him, his heart heavy with all the pain he had carried for so long. He thought of Lizzie, of all the children he had seen disappear, and of the lonely nights he had spent on the streets, yearning for a family that had never come. The rag and bone man had not been taking souls for punishment. He had been offering them an end, an escape. The figure reached out a skeletal hand, and Tommy, with tears in his eyes, stepped forward. There was no more fear, only release. "Hush, little one, don't you cry." The lullaby wrapped around him like a warm embrace, and Tommy felt his guilt slip away, the weight of it fading into nothing. He had carried it for so long, but now it was gone, and he was free. Tommy faded into the soft darkness, his last breath a sigh of peace. The rag and bone man smiled, his cart rolling silently into the night, carrying with it yet another forgotten soul, no longer burdened by the past. The streets of London were quieter now, and the lullaby was gone. For some, it had come too late. But for Tommy, it had come just in time. Story number 7. Daniel Cross was never meant to work in government tech. A quiet, reserved man, he spent most of his days behind a computer screen, making sure the security systems in the Palace of Westminster ran smoothly. But there was something about the job that always made him uneasy. Something about the old stone walls and the whispered secrets that seemed to seep into the halls of power. Daniel didn't ask questions about the work he did. He wasn't supposed to. He was just a cog in the machine, a tech worker who kept the systems running while the politicians did their thing. But lately, he'd been noticing something strange. It started with the cameras. At first, it was just a glitch, a flicker on the security footage. Nothing unusual, nothing to raise an eyebrow. But then the glitches became more frequent. And this time, the footage didn't look like static or interference. It looked wrong. In the background of some of the cameras, figures appeared, dark shapes, cloaked and hooded, standing silently in the corners of the rooms. They never moved. They never interacted with anyone. They were just there, watching. At first, Daniel assumed it was some kind of error. Maybe it was a malfunction in the system, something that could be fixed with a quick reset. But when he reviewed more footage, the figures weren't disappearing. They were appearing more often, always when Parliament was debating controversial bills. One night, Daniel decided to dig deeper. He started combing through the footage from the past few weeks, paying close attention to the moments when the figures appeared. Every time, it was during heated debates, when the bills that threatened to change the country's laws were on the table, when greed and corruption seemed to rule the halls of power. It didn't take long for him to make a connection. The figures, the watchers, they were appearing in response to something that had to do with the decisions being made by the people in power. But why? That's when he turned to his sister, Sarah. Sarah was a historian, passionate about ancient cultures and pagan rituals. Daniel had never understood her obsession with that side of their family's past, but lately, he was starting to wonder if there was something to it. Something his parents had never spoken about. Something that went deeper than he had ever realized. When he showed Sarah the footage, she went pale. Those aren't just figures, Daniel. Those are the Watchers. They're ancient spirits, guardians of the land, protectors, meant to keep the balance of the world in check. Daniel frowned. Spirits? Are you telling me those things are ghosts? Not ghosts, Sarah said, her voice trembling. They're remnants. The spirits of druids, perhaps. They were sent to watch over the land long before the monarchy, long before Parliament even existed. But something happened. The land became corrupt. The balance was lost. The Watchers grew angry. Daniel's heart began to race. But why now? Why are they appearing now? Sarah shook her head, clearly shaken. They've always been there, Daniel. They've always watched. But when Parliament began passing bills that tore at the fabric of the land, they stirred. And now, they've grown vengeful. They're trying to stop the corruption, trying to force the land back into balance. The more Daniel thought about it, the more it made sense. The bills that had been passed recently, the ones that stripped away workers' rights, the ones that gave more power to the wealthy, the ones that seemed to sell out the people, those were the ones that had triggered the Watchers. The spirits of the land were angry, and they were starting to fight back. But what did they want from him? Why were they reaching out to him? He wasn't a politician. He wasn't in charge of the bills. He was just a tech worker. That's when he started hearing the whispers. At first, they were subtle, just a whisper in the back of his mind when he was alone in the office, a flicker of thought, like a shadow passing over his thoughts. But soon, they became louder, insistent. They spoke to him when he slept, when he ate, when he was walking through Westminster's grand halls. They were like voices on the wind, calling him, "Daniel, you are the vessel. Daniel, you must listen. The land will fall." And then the dream came. Daniel was standing alone in the middle of the Palace of Westminster, the grand halls empty and silent. The figures, the watchers, stood around him, their eyes glowing with ancient fury. They reached out to him, and he felt something stir deep within him. A connection, a bond. They were trying to pull him in, to make him one of them, to use him. But there was something else there, too. A figure he didn't recognize. Someone who seemed to have control over the watchers. Someone who spoke with an authority that Daniel couldn't deny. "You are the key," the figure whispered. "The vessel of retribution." Daniel woke with a start, his heart pounding. He could still hear the voice in his head. It was real. The watchers were using him. The next day, things at work began to unravel. He couldn't ignore the whispers anymore. He couldn't focus on the tasks in front of him. His thoughts kept drifting to the watchers, to the political corruption, to the bills that were tearing the land apart. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know what. It wasn't long before things started to fall apart. The media caught wind of some of the footage he'd been reviewing. A whistleblower, they called him. Daniel was dragged into a political scandal, accused of leaking sensitive information. His name was smeared in the press, his life turned upside down. The watchers had done their work. Daniel vanished after the scandal. No one knew what happened to him. Some said he fled the country. Others said he was dead. No one ever found him. Months later, someone reviewing old footage of the Palace of Westminster found something strange. In the background of a video, right at the moment when Parliament passed the most controversial bill yet, there was a new figure among the watchers. It was Daniel Cross. He stood there, cloaked and hooded, his face obscured by shadow. He had joined them. The land was still corrupt. The watchers had not given up. And now, Daniel was one of them, watching. Forever. The whispers would never stop. The watchers would never rest. And neither would he. Story number 8. In the smoky heart of 1920 Soho, where the streets buzzed with jazz and the air was thick with gin, there was a club known only to a select few. Its name was whispered among the city's artists, writers, and those desperate enough to seek a glimpse of something beyond the veil. The club wasn't well known, but it didn't need to be. The Seance Club of Soho operated in the shadows, offering an experience like no other. Authentic seances, designed to summon the spirits of the dead. Edward Thorne had heard of the club. He had heard whispers from friends in the theater, from writers struggling with their latest projects, all of them speaking with awe about Madame Callista's seances. Some claimed they'd spoken to long-lost lovers, others swore they'd communicated with dead family members. But for Edward, the club was more than just a rumor. It was a desperate hope. His wife, Clara, had died a year ago, and he had been drowning in grief ever since. He was a playwright, once on the cusp of success, but now he couldn't write a word. His world had become a void, hollowed out by her death. When Edward learned that the Seance Club was offering a private session, he couldn't resist. It was his last chance to speak to Clara, to hear her voice once more. Perhaps she could tell him what to do. Perhaps she could offer him the peace he so desperately needed. He arrived at the club on a rainy evening, drenched but eager. The place was hidden in a narrow alley, the door unmarked, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. A woman in a flowing black gown stood at the door, her face veiled in shadow. She didn't speak, just gestured for him to follow her inside. The club was dimly lit, with flickering candles casting long, stretching shadows across the walls. There was a heavy, oppressive atmosphere in the air, as though the place was suffocating under its own secrets. At the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror framed in gold. It was a beautiful thing, but its surface seemed wrong. Edward couldn't place it, but the mirror felt alive, as if it was watching him. Madame Callista greeted him with a chilling smile, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "Welcome, Mr. Thorne. I understand you seek to speak to a loved one," she said, her voice smooth like velvet. I want to speak to Clara," Edward replied, his voice tight. "I need to hear her again. I need to know if she's at peace." "Madame." Callista nodded slowly. "Of course, but be warned, Mr. Thorne. What you seek is not a simple conversation. Once the veil is lifted, the spirits can take more than you might expect." Edward nodded, too desperate to care about the warning. He sat at the table where a few other club members were gathered. Their eyes were hollow, their faces gaunt, as though they had been attending these seances for far too long. The room grew colder, and the air grew thick with anticipation. Madame Callista began to chant in a language Edward didn't recognize, her voice rising and falling in eerie cadence. The candles flickered, casting odd shadows, and for a moment, Edward felt his heart race in anticipation. The air seemed to hum with energy, as if something was about to break through. Then, the mirror began to shift. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker in the glass like the reflection of something moving behind it. But soon, the image became clearer. Edward's breath caught in his throat as he saw her, Clara, standing on the other side of the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow with an unnatural emptiness, but it was her. It was Clara. "Clara," Edward whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out to the mirror as if he could touch her, as if he could pull her back to him. But Clara didn't speak. She just stared at him, her lips moving, but no sound came from her mouth. It was as though she was trapped, unable to communicate, unable to escape. And then the truth hit him like a slap. The spirits weren't just dead souls. They weren't loved ones or family members. They were something else. Something darker. The mirror was not a portal to the afterlife. It was a prison. And Clara wasn't speaking to him because she was trapped inside it, a prisoner to something far worse. The other members of the club, those gaunt faces, were no longer looking at him with curiosity. They were watching him with something else. Hunger. A cold, insatiable hunger. Edward stood up, his hands shaking as the truth began to unfold before him. He wasn't speaking to Clara. He was speaking to something else. Something ancient and hungry that fed on grief, on longing, on the creativity of the desperate. Madame Callista's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "The spirits do not give freely, Mr. Thorne. Every soul we summon strengthens the bond. Each session feeds them. They are ancient, and they grow stronger with each passing moment." Edward turned to her, fury rising in his chest. You're not summoning the dead. You're feeding them. You're feeding on us." Madame Callista smiled, but it was a smile full of malice. "The spirits are not ghosts, Mr. Thorne. They are not what you think. They are ancient entities, born from grief, from sorrow, from the need to create. We offer them what they want, what they need, and in return, they offer us power, creativity, influence." The realization hit him like a hammer. The club wasn't just a group of people trying to contact the dead. It was a cult, feeding these entities their sorrow, their grief, their creativity, and in return they were granted inspiration, success, and influence. But at what cost? At the cost of their very souls. Suddenly, the mirror pulsed with an unnatural light, and Edward could feel the presence behind it. Something dark, something hungry, reaching out for him. Clara's face twisted in pain, her mouth forming silent screams. He had to act. He couldn't let this continue. Not for Clara, not for anyone. In a burst of desperation, Edward grabbed a heavy chair and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The spirits howled, their forms writhing in agony as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. And then, silence. Clara's face, trapped within the mirror's reflection, vanished. But as the last piece of glass hit the floor, Edward felt a sharp, cold sensation pierce his chest. He gasped, feeling the weight of the club's curse settle onto him. Madame Callista screamed as the entities turned their attention to him, their hunger now focused entirely on him. The room seemed to pulse with power, and Edward felt his body start to tremble, his mind slipping away. He had freed Clara, but in doing so, he had taken her place. He had become the next vessel. The last thing Edward saw before everything went dark was the broken shards of the mirror on the floor, each one now reflecting his own tortured face as the club's curse claimed him. And then, nothing. When the authorities arrived to investigate the Seance Club of Soho, all they found was a pile of shattered glass and an empty room. Edward Thorne was never seen again. But the next time the club held a session, a new face appeared in the mirror, a face with hollow eyes staring out from behind the glass. And the curse continued, feeding on the grief, the creativity, and the souls of those who dared to seek it. Story number 9. The sound of hammering echoed through the damp, dark cavern beneath the Thames, where construction workers dug deeper, expanding the ever-growing labyrinth of London's underground. Marcus, the site foreman, wiped sweat from his brow, his face tight with exhaustion as he barked orders at his men. The tunnel had been difficult to breach, narrow, unstable, the air thick with the scent of old earth. But then something unexpected happened. The earth shifted. At first, it was a gentle tremor beneath their feet, nothing alarming. But then, a sickening cracking noise filled the air, followed by a series of sharp clinks and clatters as something heavy shifted in the dirt. When the dust settled, they had uncovered a wall, a smooth, polished surface that hadn't been touched in centuries. A sealed chamber. The workers stared at it, confusion and curiosity mingling in their gazes. The chamber didn't make sense. The markings etched into the stone were unfamiliar, alien to modern understanding. This wasn't part of any Roman structure or Victorian-era construction. This was something much older, much darker. They had found something buried deep beneath the city. And it wasn't long before word spread, reaching Dr. Naomi Belgrave. Naomi was an expert in ancient rituals and religious history, a calm and methodical academic who spent her days lost in dusty archives and obscure texts. But when the call came, when they described the discovery, the strange markings, and the feeling of unease in the air, Naomi couldn't ignore it. She was drawn to it, as though the city itself were calling her. When Naomi arrived at the site, she felt it immediately, the electric pulse in the air, the strange heaviness that clung to the very walls of the chamber. As she entered the cavern, her heart rate quickened, her breath shallow. The chamber seemed to hum with something ancient, something alive. The markings on the stone were a language she had seen only once before, in a forgotten scroll buried in the archives of the British Museum. It was the language of a pre-Roman cult, a cult that worshipped the river spirits. The moment she touched the stone, memories that weren't hers flooded her mind. Unseen voices whispered to her, drowning out her thoughts. She saw images, visions of another time, of a woman standing in the same spot, chanting ancient words, sealing something away. Naomi staggered back, clutching her head as the visions overwhelmed her. Naomi. It was Alex, the diver hired to investigate the waterlogged section of the tunnel. His voice broke through the chaos in her mind. "You okay?" Naomi blinked, dazed, and nodded, though she wasn't sure what was real anymore. "Whatever it is, it's old," Alex said, glancing at the markings. "I don't think this is just some forgotten Roman ruin. It feels wrong." The more Naomi studied the chamber, the more she uncovered. The cult that had worshipped beneath the waters had long since been erased from history, but their practices were clear. They had summoned river spirits, elemental beings of chaos and wrath, ancient and powerful, tied to the water that flowed through the city. The spirits were bound, sealed away for a reason, and now, as they had broken through, those spirits were free. Naomi's pulse quickened. She was beginning to understand. These weren't just simple river gods. They were beings of destruction, chaos incarnate, capable of flooding the city again if released. The rituals performed by the cult had been an attempt to contain them, to imprison them beneath the Thames forever. But now, the seal had been broken, and the spirits were waking. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her thoughts clouded by the memory of the visions, the voice of Ezra, the spirit of her past life, the high priestess who had sealed the spirits away. Ezra had been a protector, a sacrifice, and her soul had been bound to the waters to ensure the spirits remained trapped beneath the river. Naomi had never understood the connection between herself and the spirits, but now it was clear. She was Ezra. Ezra had lived in her, had become her, and Naomi had unknowingly carried her memories, her essence, throughout her life. "Ezra," Naomi whispered into the darkness of her room, her voice trembling. "Why didn't I remember?" Ezra's voice answered in her mind, calm and steady. "You had to forget, Naomi. You had to live, to find your way. But now, the spirits are free. They will rise. They will drown this city again." The next day, Naomi returned to the site, her mind heavy with the weight of her past life's purpose. As she stood before the chamber, she saw it clearly. The spirits of the river were gathering, the waters of the Thames beginning to stir with unnatural life. The river had begun to answer their call. The spirits wanted a vessel, a human body, to carry their wrath, to bring the floods upon the land once more. Naomi knew what she had to do. She had to stop them before it was too late. But the spirits would never stop. They would never rest. They needed a vessel, and they had chosen her. The days passed. Naomi's connection to the water grew stronger. She could hear the whispers in the back of her mind, feel the pull of the river beneath the surface. She began to feel the spirits pressing closer, invading her thoughts, twisting her will. The floodgates of her memories were opening, and she could no longer escape the truth. She had always been meant to stop this, but she had failed, and now it was too late. One afternoon, while standing on the banks of the Thames, watching the water swirl and churn, Naomi made her decision. She couldn't let the spirits rise. She couldn't let them drown London in chaos and destruction. She was the one who had sealed them away in the first place, and it was her responsibility to stop them, permanently. Her body trembled as she stepped closer to the water, her feet sinking into the mud, the cold Thames wrapping around her ankles. Like a living thing, the spirits were calling her, whispering her name, urging her to let go, to allow them to take control. But Naomi wasn't listening. She had made her peace. The spirits had no power over her now. She could feel Ezra within her, the past life, urging her to finish what she had started. With one final breath, Naomi let herself fall forward into the water. The cold embraced her, filling her lungs, her heart slowing as the river claimed her, and with her sacrifice, the spirits were sealed again. The next morning, the river was calm, its waters flowing peacefully as if nothing had happened. The construction workers continued their work, oblivious to the ancient battle that had taken place beneath their feet. Naomi Belgrave, the researcher who had uncovered the truth, was gone, her body lost to the Thames. But the river spirits had been contained, once again bound by her final act of surrender. For now. Story number 10. Piccadilly Circus had always been a bustling hub of life, a swirl of tourists, commuters, street vendors, and performers. It was a place where dreams could be made or crushed in a matter of seconds. For Eli Birch, a street performer with a tragic past, it was home. His specialty was ventriloquism. He had a natural gift for mimicry, a talent he'd honed since he was a boy. His puppet, Henry, was his partner, his friend, and his only constant. They'd been through it all together, through the highs, the lows, and everything in between. But recently, something had started to change in the circus. It started with the disappearances. Mina, the acrobat, had been the first. She was known for her graceful flips and flawless routines, always leaving the crowd gasping for more. One evening, she'd performed her usual routine and never returned to the street. A few days later, she was found, limp and unblinking, standing, motionless in the center of the square. Her smile was perfect, almost serene, but there was something wrong. Her eyes were dead, blank. Her movements were precise, too perfect. No one had a real explanation. Just another missing performer. Then Paolo, the juggler, vanished next. His disappearance followed the same pattern. One moment he was tossing, his flaming pins into the air with incredible flair. The next, he was gone. A week later, he returned, looking just like Mina. His eyes were hollow, his smile frozen, and his movements were impossibly smooth. It was as if he were being controlled, like a puppet on strings. Eli had heard the rumors, of course. People said it was some kind of curse. Some said it was an evil spirit haunting the square. Others talked of a mysterious figure, an old ventriloquist who had disappeared years ago. But Eli didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He was a skeptic, focused on the craft of his performance. That is, until the night he noticed something in the crowd. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, but when he looked closer, he saw him, the puppet master. The man was cloaked in black, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He stood off to the side watching the performers, his eyes locked onto Eli. There was something about the way he stood, too still, like he was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment. Then it clicked. Eli had been performing in Piccadilly for years, and he had never seen the puppet master before. But now, the man's gaze felt possessive, like he was claiming something that had to do with Eli. something that had to do with the performers disappearing. A cold shiver ran down Eli's spine as he realized the truth. The missing performers weren't just gone. They had been taken, and the puppet master wasn't just watching. They were all part of his grand show. That night, Eli stayed up late, going through old records, trying to find any trace of this mysterious figure. What he discovered was horrifying. The puppet master wasn't a man at all. He was a spirit, an ancient ghost who had been executed centuries ago for practicing dark magic. He was a ventriloquist in life, using his powers to control and manipulate people, turning them into his own personal dolls. His obsession with perfection led to his downfall, and in his death, he vowed to create the perfect show, a show that would last for all eternity. The more Eli read, the more he realized the truth. The puppet master didn't just take the performers, he possessed them, turning them into lifeless marionettes with perfect movements, trapped in an eternal performance. The ones who came back were never the same. Their souls were gone, replaced by an empty shell. But there was one thing that struck Eli as odd. He was immune. He hadn't been taken. He hadn't been possessed. The puppet master had tried, but Eli couldn't figure out why he hadn't succeeded. It was then that the answer came to him. Eli was already partially possessed. He had always been gifted with mimicry, with the ability to imitate voices and movements, flawlessly. That gift, that uncanny ability to mimic others, was the key. It was the same magic the puppet master had used to control his puppets. Eli's gift wasn't natural. It was something the puppet master had planted in him years ago, without Eli even knowing it. That night, Eli confronted the puppet master. "You've been controlling us," Eli said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "All of us. You've turned us into your puppets." The puppet master didn't respond. He simply stepped forward, his hands twisting like the strings of a marionette. His voice, when it came, was low and cold, like it was coming from a place far beyond this world. "It's too late for you, Eli," the puppet master said. "You are already one of my creations. You were always meant to be part of the show." Eli's heart raced. He couldn't escape. He was trapped in a performance he hadn't chosen, and yet there was something inside him, a spark of defiance. He had to stop this. He had to break the curse. In a final act of desperation, Eli made a decision. He would offer himself as the final act. The puppet master had taken so many before him, had twisted them into perfect dolls, but Eli wouldn't let him win. He couldn't allow this spirit to claim any more lives. Eli stepped into the center of the square, Henry, his puppet, in his hands. "I'll be your last act," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this show ends tonight." The puppet master reached out, his long fingers curling as if to pull Eli into his grasp. But before he could touch him, Eli placed Henry on the ground, his puppet now a silent witness to his final act. With one last breath, Eli pressed his hands against his chest and squeezed, pulling himself into the puppet master's hold. The ground beneath them trembled, and for a brief moment, Eli felt the cold, empty presence of the puppet master trying to take control. But this time, it was different. This time, Eli fought back, pouring all of his energy into breaking the strings that bound him. With a final, guttural cry, Eli collapsed to the ground. The puppet master's presence faded, vanishing into the night, leaving only the empty streets behind. The next morning, the street performers were gone. No one saw them again, and no one spoke of them. But Eli Birch's name lingered in the air like a whisper. Some said they still saw him in the crowd, his puppet Henry at his side. Others claimed that every now and then, in the flickering light of the circus, they could hear the faint sound of a puppet's string being pulled. And in Piccadilly Circus, the show went on, with one performer missing. The final act. Forever. If you're ready to dive into the chilling, unsettling tales of London's haunted past, hit subscribe, and don't forget to like and share this video. You won't want to miss the spine-tingling secrets we're about to reveal. Do you have the courage to face what's lurking beneath London's streets? Tune in and let's uncover the darkness together.